I just want to say before I start it, it's a real honor for me to be here. When we started Burleson Family Association in 1981, we had no idea that it would grow into what it did and what it would lead to with the Burleson Family Research Group. I think it was a first really effort, I guess, to kind of get the different family groups across the U.S. together to try to pool our research and to try to have a better understanding of the different Burleson families. I know in 1981, we did not know anything about Ann Newport Royal's book, Early Letters from Alabama. We knew of Edward Burleson up in Connecticut, but we didn't have the town plat. We didn't have all his children and grandchildren. We were in the dark ages of family research, and now with the DNA testing and everything else, it's just, we've gone from the darkness to the light, in my opinion, with our family research. So much has come to light. Even in the last 10 years for me, I found out so much more about my family. And I feel like in the next 38 years, it'll even be more. But I just want to thank y'all for having me over here today, and hope I don't bore you too much. But I'm going to give you a program about my great-great-grandfather, Jonathan Burleson. And I know it's going to be hard to see, but he was born 230 years ago, probably here in North Carolina. See, there's another mystery we hadn't solved. His family Bible burned up in a house fire in 1911. In the Bible, it stated he was born near Lexington, Kentucky, October the 6th, 1789. However, 1790 census, Rutherford County, his father was still living here and him as a child. So, and on the census in Morgan County, Alabama, he always listed his birth state as North Carolina. So I'm leaning more toward North Carolina than I am Lexington, Kentucky, because I don't think they went to Kentucky till close to 10 years after he was born. But just to kind of give you the relationship, Jonathan's father was John Burleson. And again, that doesn't explain a lot in itself, but I'm going to give you a little background. John Burleson, Jonathan's father, was a son of Aaron Burleson. We're all familiar with the Sullivan County will of Aaron Burleson, written 1781. This is the will here, and he mentions, the first reference I have to John anywhere is in this will when he mentions his son John, Jonathan, and Joseph. He's going to give them a mare, and to each of the sons a good rifle gun when they come of fit, F-E-E-T, age. Now, evidently Aaron did not write this will. If you look at the top of it where it's got his name, Aaron Burleson, it's spelled A-R-O-N. Somebody went back later and tried to put an A right above it to get it spelled right, but they spelled Burleson, L-I-S-O-N. But when he signed it at the bottom, he had it right. So, but that's the first reference I have to John. And John was probably born here in North Carolina. I mean, John Hoyle's research indicates that Aaron lived over on Sandy Run Creek from about 1766 to about 1774. John was born either 67 or 68. If you read Ann Newport Royal's book, she mentions Joseph, and he relates his early years when his father died. He references his mother's oldest son, 14-year-old. Doesn't give his name, but he's talking about John. And that'd put him either 67, 68 being born. So that Sandy Run Creek area over there, branch, was where my known family lived at that point. Of course, we can all speculate that Aaron's father was Jonathan and all of that. But John and his brothers and sisters, most of you in here kin to Isaac Burleson. If our calculations are correct, Isaac and John would have been first cousins. So, but John and them moved up to Kentucky about 1797, give or take a year. Nothing's exact in this, okay? They were up there to the early 1800s. Around 1803, they moved to Tennessee. Exactly where, we're not certain. Joseph showed up, and Joseph, by the way, is the one that's Bibles in the Alamo, if y'all familiar with that bit of history. But Joseph was a captain of militia in White County, Tennessee in 1807. And that would put them coming into Alabama, what became Alabama, about 1808. I've always used 1808. But my Uncle Howard, who'd spent about 35 years doing genealogy research, made a reference that he'd seen a petition that John, his son Jonathan, signed in 1810 stating they'd been on that land since 1807. So I haven't seen that. I'm just going to try to verify it before I use that date, but I'm going to try to use 1808 as much. JD, you want to move ahead a little bit? And any questions y'all got as I'm struggling through this, feel free to ask, okay?
What's worth more, a mare or a good rifle gun?
I don't know. I would think a good rifle gun would have been worth more to them because they were constantly at war with some group of people. The three brothers, Joseph, James, and John, show up in a list of intruders on Indian lands. It was in Mississippi Territory at that time, later became Alabama Territory, later became the state of Alabama. But they were in the Limestone Creek settlement. That list was prepared May the 29th, 1809. But they were on shared hunting grounds of the Chickasaw and Cherokee, and the federal government came in there and ran them out. And most of them went back to Huntsville, and that's where John and his son Jonathan wound up. First reference I have to Jonathan Burleson is 1812. He'd been 21 years old, I guess, about that year, 23, but he was a constable over in Madison County. And also 1813 is when he married Elizabeth Bird. And now John stayed in Madison County for several years. He got a grant from the federal government in 1812 on 160 acres, which would be pretty much just north and west a little bit of where downtown Huntsville is. And I've got a copy of the deed over there later on where he sold part of that and moved to Morgan County. JD, you want to move up one?
How was he spelling his name at that time?
John?
Yeah, last name.
They all spelled it L-E-S-O-N. Yeah. As far as I know, that's the way they always spelled it, unless it was just written wrong by somebody else. Okay? They didn't have the L-E-Y or the L-I-S-O-N in it. Yeah. This is 1818 map of Alabama. It was Alabama Territory then. It's the earliest map I've got. But just to give you an idea of what part of Alabama we're talking about. But this is Madison County over here. It's the first county really in Alabama. It was formed in 1808. And at that time, just visualize state Alabama, you had Madison County, and then you had the community of Mobile down on Mobile Bay. Everything else in between was Indian lands. And it was the shared hunting grounds of Cherokee and the Chickasaw mostly. So west of Huntsville was the Indian territory. This where, if you can see that 2 there, that's Limestone Creek. That's where they settled they were there in 1809 when that list was prepared. After they run out there, they went back to Madison County, and after the Creek Indian War, they migrated into Morgan County, and where that X is there is where Jonathan settled and where, we still live today. You want to advance that one more, JD? All right, Creek Indian War came about. It was an outgrowth of the War of 1812. Most of you in here probably read about the Fort Mims massacre in South Alabama, about 30 miles north of Mobile. The Creeks attacked it in I guess it was, late August 1813, killed over 250 white settlers there. And that just ignited the settlers that was in Alabama, and they were all feared the Indian attack. And they pleaded with the state of Tennessee to send troops down there to try to fight the Indians. Well, Andrew Jackson was a major general in the Tennessee militia, and one thing led to another, and he wound up a major general in the U.S. Army. And he came through Huntsville in October 1813. And there he was joined by a group of Burlesons. They were all in 7th Battalion, Perkins Regiment. And in that regiment, there was several companies. One of the companies was, the captain was James Burleson. And in that company, there was at least 7 Burlesons. James had his son Edward. Joseph had him and his son, I think James was in there, yeah. John Burleson had 2 sons in there, Aaron Burleson and Jonathan. Jonathan was a lieutenant in the cavalry. James was captain, the rest were privates. Now, if you look at the list of Burlesons in his company, you see a Joseph Burleson Jr. We have yet to figure out who that is. John didn't have a son, Joseph. James had a son, Joseph, but he was like 12 years old at that time. And Joseph had a son by the name of Joseph, but he wasn't about 6 years old. We don't know where that Joseph Burleson comes in, but there's another 10 to 12 Burlesons in the militia from the state of Tennessee, so it could have been they just wound up in James's unit. But James also had 3 son-in-laws in that unit. And of course, they all wound up at Horseshoe Bend, which occurred March 27th, 1814. It's what broke the back of the Indian resistance. They killed more than 900 warriors. The warriors decided to fight to the death. They would not surrender. They did capture 350 women and children there. I don't know exactly where the Burlesons were in relation to that battle. I never have studied it, but I know the majority of them wound up charging the breastworks here. And it's claimed that Martin Taylor, James Burleson's son-in-law, was the 3rd man over the breastworks there, but that's just family legend. I have no idea. David Crockett was there. Young Sam Houston, he was only 20 years old, but he was a sergeant in the Tennessee militia. He was there. And that's where they got to know Sam Houston, and he'll come into play later on in this story. But after that war, I read 2 different accounts. At the Treaty of Fort Jackson, the Creeks ceded either 15 million to 20 million acres. I don't know what's the accurate account, but they ceded most of Alabama. Then in 1816, the Cherokees ceded land, which included the part south of the Tennessee River. And that's what brought my family into Morgan County. J.D., you want to advance a little bit? They arrived in Morgan County probably the early spring of 1816. Jonathan's first son, Aaron Burleson, was born August 1st, 1816, and he was born in Morgan County. So that helps us date when they arrived there. Now, one of Jonathan's sons, Dabney, always told my uncle, his father told him they came over the year before and planted crops, so they'd been over here before, but it's still Indian lands, and they couldn't officially settle in here. But these are the tract books of Morgan County, and this area here indicates 80 acres, and that area there indicates 80 acres. That was his first official entry. Jonathan got 160 acres, 2 80-acre tracts that adjoin each other, north and south. And they're both dated July 1818. And they were there 1816, but they didn't have the survey work done. And they worked all during 1817. John Coffey, of Creek Indian War fame, he was a surveyor for that area, so the first official land sales were then. And but they were there 1816, and that's where he got his start on that 160 acres. Now, and from what we understand, he carried all that he owned on a pack horse or 2. They had all been frontiersmen. They didn't have any money. Some of the early settlers in the county that acquired a lot of land, they'd been well-to-do before they got there, but Jonathan was not. And but they settled on I think this tract right here, and the remnants of the old chimney, probably their second home, is still there. You want to go up one? Yeah, this, I'm not sure this is the chimney of the original cabin, but they'd been there a few years and built a 2-story log house, and I feel like that's what this is from, that 2-story log house. And right next to it, about 300 feet away, is the family cemetery. He started out, I know, as a simple farmer. I don't know when he really transitioned from just a yeoman farmer to a slave owner and a plantation owner. Probably grew into it during the 1820s and 30s. Looked like mid to late 1820s is when he acquired a good bit of land, and on through the 1840s he acquired a good bit of land. J.D., you want to go? His father, John, stayed in Madison County, but in December 1816 he sold his property over there. This is a copy of the deed, 80 acres of it, and you can see he and his second wife, Mary, they both signed with X. They could not read or write. But John came into Morgan County and settled in West Morgan County, about 10, 12 miles from where Jonathan settled, a little community called Wolftown. And he died there in 1824. Don't know much about John. You know, his second wife, Mary, they had anywhere from 4 to 5 children. We just don't know for sure. There was a son by the name of Thomas that the only time he's even mentioned is in John's estate settlement. John's oldest son by his second wife was a James Burleson, and he settled his estate, and they mentioned Thomas in there. But shortly after they settled the estate, Mary took her young children north to Illinois. Her oldest son by her first marriage, Seth Hodges, lived up in Carlinville, Illinois. I think kind of northeast of where St. Louis is. You want to move forward? All right, this is John Burleson Jr. That was one of the younger sons of John. And he was born in 1812, and she took him up to Illinois, and he lived out his life up there, married and had 10 or 12 children. And the family kind of lost touch with him until after the war between the states. And finally, I guess, located him in the early 1880s. That's the only picture I have of John. And go ahead and move up some. But Jonathan, back to him, he, of course, he started farming. Of course, they were all Baptists, very religious, and he was one of the founders of Mount Pisgah Baptist Church, about 2 miles from the plantation. It was founded in 1824, really, as Cedar Springs was the name of it. And when they built the new building in 1830, they changed the name of it to Mount Pisgah. Well, Jonathan was a deacon there. One of the issues, the church didn't grow very much. I know they said by early 1830s, they had fewer than 30 members, said there was a bad drinking problem among the congregation and they couldn't keep a minister there. So, but within about 10 years, I know they left good church records, and at one time in the late 1840s, they had about 180 members, about 140 white members and 40 black members of the church. Some of Jonathan's slaves went to church there, sure did. Well, like I said, it's about 2 miles, but that's where his two sons, Rufus and Richard, they got their start as Baptist ministers there at Mount Pisgah. Just a little bit about some of his children. I don't have photographs of all of them, but his oldest son, Aaron, that was born in Morgan County, he wound up a medical doctor, and he married Janet Pattison, Pattison, about 1845. And in 1850, her father, Alexander Pattison, gave them a home in Decatur. It was called Riverview at that time. You want to go ahead? That's a 1902 portrait of it. The house was built about 1833 by John Sevier Ray, came down from Tennessee. And Alexander Pattison bought the place and gave it to Aaron and Janet about 1850. And they lived there till right after the war between the states. Aaron was a major in the Confederate Army. He was a medical doctor, but the records I've seen of him, he was in the Quartermaster Corps more than anything else, stationed a good bit near Memphis and over near Grenada, Mississippi. The thing about this home, a lot of your antebellum books, home books, and tell you in relation to the war between the states, this is the most historic house in the state of Alabama relating to the war. The reason was it was right on the river in Decatur, and it was right by where the Memphis and Charleston Railroad ran. And if you know your Civil War history, you'll realize that they called the Memphis and Charleston the backbone of the Confederacy. It was the only railroad we had that went in a general east-west direction through the Confederate States. And where it crossed the river there at Decatur was a key strategic point. And Decatur was occupied right after Battle of Shiloh in 1862. And from 1862 to the end of the war, I think it changed hands maybe 8 times during that period of time. The home was used as to quarter the officers on the Confederate side, and they were invited in. The Yankee officers were not invited, but they used that for sometimes headquarters, sometimes just residence. Toward the end of the war, it says headquarters district, North Alabama District, Decatur, March 1865. But in 1864, when General Dodge retook Decatur, he ordered everybody out of the town, including Aaron's wife and 4 girls. And they went to Memphis. And at that time, I know General Granger used it for his headquarters after that, and evidently right at the end of the war, it was for the North Alabama District. But Aaron lost the house in bankruptcy. You know, everybody was busted after the war. And one of the Yankee officers that had been down during the war, Jerome Hines, wound up buying the home. And he lived there, or his family, he and his family, for about 40 years. And then the McIntyre family bought it in 1895. Go ahead, J.D. This is a picture of the home today. It's called the Burleson Hines McIntyre home. And it's for sale now. What, $600,000 we found out, didn't we, J.D.? But if anybody's got any money and want it, it's overpriced in my opinion. Probably needs a lot of work. But it is a beautiful old home. If you show that next picture, J.D. These photos my wife and I made in 1995. And if you look real close, you can see my wife there in the mirror taking a picture. So, but it was a very elegant home in its day. It had some wonderful trim work in it and very elaborate wainscoting and all of that. But it's been out of the family since he lost it to bankruptcy after the war. But Aaron wound up living in Memphis and lived and died over there. Go ahead, J.D., and move on. His second oldest son, William Byrd Burleson, he wound up living. My great-great-grandfather gave him a 400-acre farm just north of his plantation, and he lived and died there. He died right at the end of the war between the states, and that was his wife, Minerva. They left several children, and there's a few of their descendants left in Morgan County today. Go ahead, J.D. Richard Byrd Burleson, he wound up a Baptist preacher. He did not move to Texas to about 1855 or 6, and he wound up a professor of natural history at Baylor University when it was in Independence, Texas. And like I say, he was vice president there, and then they moved to Waco, and he died there in 1879. There are several Burleson descendants out there that are descended from him. Go ahead, J.D. His younger brother by a year was Rufus Columbus Burleson. He was a noted Baptist preacher also. They both got their start there at Mount Pisgah. Rufus wound up moving to Texas about 1846. He went to school, seminary school up in Kentucky and Nashville, several other places, even taught over in Mississippi for a while, and wound up in Texas 1846. Well, 1851, he'd made a name for himself in Houston, and the president of Baylor at Independence had resigned, and they asked Rufus to take the school over, and he did. And he was president at Baylor from about 1851 to 1861. And he and his brother Richard at that time left and went to Waco. But this is an early pen and ink sketch of Baylor University campus at Independence. And this is Tryon Hall, which had the chapel and I think the classrooms in it. But it's interesting how, it was a male and female side, and the town kind of lay in between. On the south side on the hill was the men's facilities, the women's facilities on the south side of town, and all the teachers lived in between, I guess to make sure that they didn't get together any more than they should. But go ahead, J.D., and move it up. But it was while he was at Independence that he wound up baptizing Sam Houston. Sam and his family lived in Independence. At one time, Independence was the capital of the state of the Republic. So that's why they were all there. And he wound up, this is a creek in the background there, but that's a state marker, and you really got to hunt to find it. Now I'm going to tell you. But evidently baptized him in November 1854, and Rufus was pastor of the Independence Baptist Church at that time. And the story goes that after they dunked old Sam Houston, Rufus told him that the waters of this creek have washed away all your sins. And old Sam said, well, my God, help the poor fish. That's all he could say. Sam kind of had a reputation as he wasn't as a religious person as he could have been, I guess. But anyway, Rufus resigned early 1861 and moved to Waco and took over the presidency of a brand new Baptist university called Waco University. Go ahead and hit that slide. And that's a pen and ink of it on a letterhead. He'd written my great-granddaddy. But by 1885, all I think Baptist colleges in the state of Texas were having financial trouble. And I think Rufus was somewhat instrumental in getting Baylor and Waco University to merge. And that's when it moved from Independence to Waco. And he was the first president of Baylor University when it was at Waco. And he lived out his life in Waco, Texas, and he's buried in Oakwood Cemetery. But that's a statue they erected to him there. I don't know what year they erected that statue. I never have read anything about it. But go to that next slide. If you go out there today, there's the Burleson quadrangle, and that's his statue there to the left of center. And right over here to the left is the Ming Library, and they have a good collection of photographs and early letters of his and correspondence he had with different people. I've given them copies of what original letters I have from Rufus to my great-grandfather, and probably one day I'll just give them the originals, but I just hard to part with them, though, to be honest with you. But go ahead and other children, this is Isabella Humphreys and her husband, Boville Humphreys. They moved to Waco in 1867, and they're also buried there in Oakwood Cemetery, along with Rufus and their brother Richard. Go ahead, J.D., move that. Another one of his daughters was Edna Turney. She lived out her life in Morgan County. This photo was made about 1858. Two of her young daughters there with her. She married a Dr. Turney, and there's several descendants in the county today that relate to Edna. Go ahead, J.D. Now, this is Emily Burleson, another one of Jonathan's daughters. She married Billy Williams, and they moved to Waco, Texas. She and her husband are also buried in Oakwood Cemetery. So there's 4 of Jonathan's children buried in Waco. Another daughter, Mary, who is Dabney Burleson's twin sister, she's buried in El Paso, Texas. She lived out her declining years there. So 5 of Jonathan's children. We talk about that Alabama-Burleson connection. Well, it was really major in my family. Now, this is my great-grandfather, Dabney Burleson. He's the youngest son of Jonathan by his first marriage, and he'll play an important part in the state later on. He was born in 1835 and died in 1912. But back to Jonathan a little bit. This is a portrait of him. These are copies of the land grants, one in 1835, the other in 1839. I chose those because these encompass the land where he wound up building his home, his final home, in 1841. It's kind of halfway in between. I mean, it's hard to tell on what section it actually is because it's just about on the line. But I feel, see, he'd already lived there about 25 years before he built the house, and I often think that he and his wife Elizabeth had planned to build that home. But she died in 1839, and I think the house was started in 1840. I often think that they planned it together, and he just decided to go ahead and build it. But he was actually single when he built the home. Go ahead, J.D. Go ahead through that. This is the earliest picture I have of his home place, the old mountain home they called it. And this photo was made in the late 1890s. The house almost 60 years old before we have a photograph of it. We don't know what it looked like originally. This trim and all that stuff is more of a Victorian thing. So it was added by my grandfather when he took over the house. So we have no idea what it looked like originally. All right, go ahead, J.D. But to commemorate it, there's a engraved limestone rock in one of the chimneys, Jonathan Burleson, October 6, 1841. He chose October 6 because that was his birthday. He was 52 years old when that house was completed. Okay. In 1843, he remarried. He married Ann Humphreys. She was a widow of Dr. Carlisle Humphreys. She and Jonathan had one son, Roby Adair Burleson. I do not have any photographs of him, unfortunately. I'd love to. But Roby probably played a more important part, I guess, in preserving the plantation than people give him credit for. He was the one that stayed at plantation. All the other sons had moved off. But Roby was there when the war started in '61. He wasn't but about 14, 15 years old, and he never did join the Confederate Army because I guess because of his father, Jonathan, later years had dementia. And between managing the plantation and looking after his father, there wasn't any way he could go serve. Go ahead, J.D. But Jonathan died the year after the war ended, 1866. He died 5 o'clock in the morning, September 24th. Roby was at his bedside and Dabney was there also. They had the funeral the next day, the 25th. Jackson Gunn, a famous Baptist preacher in our area. Jackson had performed the wedding ceremonies of several of Jonathan's children, but he performed the funeral. And it rained all day, and it was very cold, according to Roby's diary. So, but he's buried next to him in this tomb. That's his first wife, Elizabeth. She died in 1839. And I often say about Elizabeth, you know, you read in all these watered-down histories how elegant the plantation owners and all had it, but Elizabeth, bless her heart, they got married when she just turned 17, had her first child when she was 19, and over the next 22 years, she had 13 children. And she died when she was still 42 years old. Just a hard, hard life. It's sad. Go to the next one. That's the cemetery. This picture's made several years ago, but I don't know if you can see this rock there, but Jonathan's wife, Elizabeth, this is her mother, Lydia Bird, and she died in 1838. And it's hard to see it, but there's a little tomb in there. That's their daughter, Elizabeth. She died when she was less than 2 years old. All the other 12 children Jonathan had lived to adults anyway. The other burials in there relate to children of 2 of his daughters. Now, my daddy always said on the back side of the cemetery there's several graves of some of the slaves, which I don't doubt, but they never were marked, so we just don't really know. And even most of these tombstones of those children, they were moved. My uncle lost that property during the Depression, and my daddy said the people that got it just moved a lot of the tombstones up to the front just to make more room to graze their cattle in the back, see? So we don't know exactly where they went or go originally. But last couple of years we've had the cemetery surveyed out. The owner of it did that, and he's got it, it's a reserved cemetery now, so no one can do anything. It encompasses a little bit more than half an acre. And I go in there every year or two and try to clean it up a little bit and just keep it presentable, which is not saying much. Go ahead, J.D. All right, back to Dabney Burleson, my great-granddaddy. When Jonathan died, he did not leave a will. When he died, he owned about 5,500 acres of land. 880 of it was over in North Mississippi. About 2,600 of it was around the home place out there. And the other land was scattered out in Morgan County. And it took Dabney over 10 years to settle that estate. He was appointed administrator, and his brother Roby and son-in-law brother-in-law Jonathan Orr, I think, went on his bond with him to do that. But it was a struggle. A lot of the letters I have are from his brothers and sisters in Texas, Mississippi, and around, and everybody's won't know when he's going to sell the estate. They all need money. Everybody's busted. So it was a trying time for my great-granddaddy, but he finally got it settled, but it took a while. Go ahead, J.D. This is the state auction notice. They'd originally scheduled the state sale in October 1869, but it was wound up November the 4th. And it was held on the grounds there at his house. It took several hours, but they disposed of a lot of personal property and all the real estate. Now, I guess the court-appointed commissioners had set aside 900 acres for his widow Ann's dowry. dire interest. Back then, she didn't get a interest other than a life estate. And they used a third of that 2,600 acres there as her dower. And at the state auction, her son Roby bought it. And of course, his plans was to let her live there as long as she could. But 2 months, I guess 2 months and 1 day after that, Roby died. He was, according to my father, he was drunk. He was coming back from a priceful at a tavern. January the 5th, 1870, he was thrown from his horse. And it was at night, and the temperatures were in the 0 range, and he froze to death. And he'd never married, left no children. But see, that left the estate in turmoil, because 2 months before he'd bought the dire interest, but he'd only paid for a third of it. He had to pay the rest of it in over a 3-year period. But his half-sister Mary stepped in and bought his interest, according to the probate records. But what's not clear is when Dabney wound up with it, sometime probably mid-1770s. I just don't know for sure. Those records have been lost. So, but Dabney wound up with that tract, plus about 400 other acres in the valley. Go ahead, J.D. And I'm not certain Dabney ever lived there after the war between the states. He'd married Sally Orr out in the Danville area, about 10 miles west of there, and they lived out there till about 1874, and they moved to Hartselle. Hartselle had only been founded in 1870, and they moved up there because his stepmother was still living there, and she didn't die about 1878. And from my understanding, according to my Uncle Howard's notes, Dabney after that just used the old mountain home as a summer home. And they'd go out there and stay and, you know, farm, whatever, and give the kids a chance to play out there on the place. But Dabney only had one son that lived, and that was Jonathan Orr Burleson, and that's him. That's my grandfather. He was born 1861, died in 1929, and being the only son, he wound up with the farm. He moved up there in 1892 and redid the house, but Dabney did not deed him that house until about 1903, I guess it was, something like that. But he's the one, go ahead, J.D., the next, but Jonathan was the one that redid the house 1892 and 3, and he added all that gingerbread, that reverse picket and bracket decoration on it, because that would not date from the time period that house was built. But when it was built, it was a very simple Federal-style home, just a big old box house, 4 rooms on the bottom floor and 4 rooms on top, a room in the attic, and then a place to get out on top. But this picture was made in 1901. The only person we've been able to officially identify, my father always said that was his older brother, Howard. He was the genealogist of the family, and a lot of the early information we have about the family comes from him. Go ahead, J.D. Jonathan, of course, he lived out there till he died in 1929, but on January the 10th, 1919, he sat down, deeded all his real estate to his 11 surviving children. Not only did he write the deeds, he wrote the legal descriptions himself. They're all in his handwriting. I've got most of them at home, the original deeds. But he chose my father, Forrest E. Burleson. He was born 1895. He chose him to give the home place to. And one of his brothers told me and my brother 30, 40 years ago, chose him because he knew he would keep the place. He said the other sons would all lose it. And must have been something to that. The older ones lost everything that had been given them. But he wound up about 60 acres in the home place. But it was really, of course, my father grew up there, but they built a house in Hartselle in 1911 where all the kids could go to school. We're only about 4 miles north of Hartselle, but you couldn't go to school there in the winter because you couldn't travel from the home out there. Go ahead, J.D., and move that. So by 1916, or early, see, the house is already kind of falling apart, shingles off the roof, the windows out on it, and all of that. So it's getting in pretty bad shape. And my father, he lived in Hartselle, but he got involved in a lot of things that kept him on the go. not only did he teach school, but he played baseball. He played at Florence State Teachers College, even played in the semi-pro leagues. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Kitty League, Kentucky, Indiana, and Tennessee. He played the 2 or 3 years with them. He was in the state legislature for 2 terms, late 20s, early 30s. He was also captain in the National Guard unit in Hartselle, and that kept him on the go. So he was real busy. That's why he didn't, my father never even got married till he was 52 years old. The people that knew him said they never thought he'd get married because he didn't have time to get married. So, but anyway, the house just kept, declining. This is a photo of it in the back of it in 1934. That's some of his students from school. He always had a picnic every year out on the mountain. And that's the back of the house, and you can see no paint on it, the roof, columns and all, just really deteriorating. But in about 1937, he decided to make that his permanent home. He was out of the National Guard. He wasn't playing baseball, and so he was just left with farming and teaching schools. So he felt like he had time to do it. So he moved out there, and in 37 and 8, go ahead, J.D., he redid the place, renamed it Westview, and that's a photo of it in 1940. He added the columns to the front, and at that time, I believe, is when he added electricity, and he added a couple bathrooms in the house. And he lived there the last 31 years or so of his life. And go ahead, J.D., and move that. And this is a photo of it in 1966. The one that's on the cover of the book. A guy did a postcard on the house, and that was the postcard picture that he put on there. But after my father did work on it in 37 and 8, he never did do much more work on it till he died. It was getting in pretty bad shape. Go ahead, J.D. My father sat down in 1955. I was 4 years old. Well, actually, I was 4 and my brother was 5, yeah. And he deeded my brother, that's my brother Bill, deeded him a place in 40 acres. He was the oldest son, so he gave it to him. But my brother loved the place, but he just didn't have any inclination to work on it. And later in life, he had some health problems. So my wife and I were able to swap him a house and some acreage that we had for the home place in 40 acres in 1987. Go ahead, J.D. That was a picture of how I made that photo May 1987, the month we swapped houses and all with my brother, and we moved in there. We spent about 2 years working on the place. Go ahead, J.D., move. And that was the end result. That photo was made in 1989. And so we moved up there in May of 87 and been there ever since. That's what, 32 years. But I grew up in that house, so total years living there, been over 50 years. So I don't know where else I'd live now. I can't ever see going into a nursing home. I hope I just hope the funeral home comes carry me out there in about 30, 40 years, J.D., not anytime soon. But I'm the 5th generation to live there, and my 2 sons, Aaron and Forrest, they're the 6th generation to live there. We've been fortunate to keep it in the family. I think what's helped it was so isolated at that time because of road conditions. There just wasn't any real market for it. But if it hadn't been for my father in 1937 decided to move back out there and save it, I'm sure it would have been on the ground like a lot of old houses. But we had a restoration architect help us, and he looked under that house back in 87, and he said he'd only ever seen one other antebellum home that well constructed, and he wasn't talking about anything fancy on the inside. He was talking about the foundation of it, the floor joists, the seals, and everything. I mean, it's got floor joists in it. They're like 6 by 8 inches, just hand hewn, and the seals around that house are 9 inches by 11 inches, just hewn oak. So and they raised it off the ground anywhere from 3 to 4 feet. So it stayed dry. Termites were never an issue there. In fact, it had never been treated for termites until we got the house in 87, and we've got it under bond now. But it's been fun. It's been expensive. We didn't quite bankrupt ourselves when we got it, but we came awful close to doing it. But we've enjoyed living there, and it's a good place to raise my children. And I have so much family history there. I guess that's why I got interested in genealogy at an early age. See, I was only 30 years old when we formed the Burleson Family Association, so I kind of got on board early. But I often remember, I think William Burleson, William S. Burleson, hopefully y'all had the opportunity to know him. He was a driving force behind the Burleson Family Association. I never seen anybody so eager to learn about the Burleson family. He had a lot of questions about his Burleson line, and he was just so hungry for all that information. But if it hadn't been for him, Mary Bell Keller, I mean, they were the driving force of it for years. And then when Helen Kelso took over as editor, it took another leap forward. So due to people like them, we just got a lot to be thankful for on what we know today about our family.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you very much.
All right, JD. Thank y'all for putting up with me.